There's a very specific number buried in China's energy data that doesn't behave like a headline is supposed to. It doesn't spike, it doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't fit cleanly into the usual transition narrative people like to repeat. Solar capacity additions in recent reporting cycles from China's National Energy Administration have been consistently outpacing coal additions by a wide margin. Not in theory, not in projections, in physical grid connection terms, megawatts that actually get tied into the system. At the same time, coal is still being built. That's the part that confuses most outside observers, because the instinct is to treat this like a substitution story. One replaces the other. But that's not what the data shows. China's system is doing something more layered. It is adding solar at industrial scale, tens of gigawatts per quarter in some periods, while coal continues to enter the grid, but increasingly as a stability instrument rather than a growth engine. Now, the phrase "solar has surpassed coal" needs precision. In total installed capacity, coal is still significant in absolute terms. But in marginal additions, the new capacity being added to the system, solar has effectively dominated for multiple consecutive reporting windows. In some months, solar alone accounts for more new capacity than all other generation types combined. That distinction matters, because power systems are not defined by what exists, but by what is being built next. If you zoom out, China's logic becomes less ideological and more mechanical. The country is not reducing coal on a fixed timetable. It is overbuilding generation capacity across the board, then letting utilization rates and dispatch economics sort hierarchy over time. Solar fits this strategy unusually well. It is fast to deploy, domestically manufactured, and increasingly cheap at scale due to vertical integration in polysilicon, panel production, and inverter supply chains. Coal, by contrast, is slow capital, long approval cycles, longer construction timelines, and rising pressure from grid balancing constraints. So the system tilts, not because coal suddenly becomes obsolete, but because solar becomes the more efficient unit of capacity expansion. There is also a less discussed layer here. Provincial governments in China are measured on a mix of energy security, GDP contribution, and industrial output stability. Solar projects can be approved quickly, built quickly, and counted quickly toward targets. Coal plants require longer justification cycles and increasingly complex grid integration planning. That creates a behavioral bias in the system, not ideological, administrative. And this is where the comparison with the West becomes structurally uncomfortable. Many Western energy systems debated substitution as a policy question. China treated it as a manufacturing and deployment problem. Once solar production scaled beyond domestic absorption capacity, the question stopped being, should we build more, and became, how fast can the grid absorb it? But even that framing is incomplete, because coal is not disappearing from China's system. It is being repositioned. Increasingly, coal plants are being built or retained as load-following assets, effectively stabilizers for intermittent generation, not primary growth drivers, which leads to a subtle inversion. Coal is no longer the center of expansion. It is becoming the buffer around expansion. That is a different kind of hierarchy shift, not a replacement, a reordering. And it raises a more uncomfortable technical question that doesn't get enough attention in external commentary. What happens when solar capacity growth continues at this pace, but grid storage, transmission, and pricing mechanisms lag behind? Because capacity is not the same as usable power, and China's grid is now entering a phase where the constraint is less generation and more integration. At this point, I'm not fully convinced the surpassed coal framing captures the real transition. It's directionally true in expansion dynamics, but structurally incomplete if you're measuring actual energy displacement at system level. Still, the trajectory is hard to ignore. The system is clearly optimizing for something other than coal primacy. The doubt I keep returning to is simple. Is this a managed transition or an accumulation phase that will later force a correction in utilization economics? Because those are not the same outcome. And the prediction, based strictly on current installation patterns and policy signaling, is this. Solar will continue to dominate new capacity additions in China for the foreseeable cycle, but coal will not decline in absolute terms nearly as fast as external narratives assume. The gap between capacity growth and actual energy substitution will define the next phase of interpretation errors coming out of global energy analysis. The moment you try to explain this shift only through policy slogans, the picture breaks. Because China's energy system isn't moving because someone declared a transition. It's moving because multiple technical incentives started aligning in a way that made solar the easiest thing to build at scale. Start with the manufacturing base. This is the part most external commentary still underweights. China didn't just deploy solar. It built the entire upstream chain domestically. Polysilicon refining in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, wafer slicing in Jiangsu, module assembly clusters in Anhui and Zhejiang. By the time global prices started falling sharply around 2022 to 2024, China wasn't reacting to cheap solar. It was exporting it. That matters because once capital cost collapses, the bottleneck shifts, not to technology, to permission. And permission in China's provincial system behaves differently for different assets. A solar farm in Qinghai or Gansu doesn't require the same multi-layered thermal approval structure that a coal plant does. It doesn't trigger the same long environmental assessment cycles. It doesn't lock a province into decades of fuel logistics. So when provincial governments are evaluated on near-term investment throughput, solar becomes the rational default. Fast approval, fast construction, fast statistical contribution to fixed asset investment. Coal sits in the opposite category. It is still politically and structurally relevant, but it is administratively heavy. Even where approvals continue, they are increasingly justified under grid stability or peak load assurance rather than pure capacity expansion. Now layer the grid reality on top of that. Western China, Xinjiang, Gansu, Ningxia, produces more solar than it can immediately transmit. Curtailment used to be a major issue, especially in earlier phases of deployment. Panels generating power that never reached eastern demand centers like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, or Guangdong. But over the last few years, China has been aggressively expanding ultra-high voltage transmission lines. These are not incremental upgrades. They are structural rewirings of geography. Long-distance DC lines designed to move power across thousands of kilometers with relatively low loss. Still, even with that build-out, transmission lags generation. So you get a very specific economic behavior. Provinces continue building solar because installation metrics matter immediately, while grid absorption catches up slowly in a different budget cycle. Coal, meanwhile, behaves differently. A coal plant is not just generation. It is fuel logistics, water consumption planning, rail coordination, and long-term dispatch forecasting. In regions like Inner Mongolia or Shanxi, coal still anchors local employment and fiscal planning. But its role in expansion is increasingly defensive, replacing retiring inefficient units or stabilizing intermittency, not driving new capacity dominance. There's a case study that illustrates this tension clearly. In Gansu's Jiayuguan corridor, solar parks expanded rapidly during the 2020 to 2024 cycle. At peak sunlight hours, output often exceeded local demand by multiples. Early on, curtailment rates were high enough that a significant portion of generated power was effectively wasted. Instead of slowing expansion, local governments doubled down, pairing solar farms with new transmission commitments tied to national grid companies. The rationality wasn't local consumption efficiency. It was installation continuity. Once infrastructure momentum begins, stopping it carries administrative cost. Now compare that to coal project behavior in provinces like Shanxi. Even when approvals exist, new coal capacity is increasingly structured around flexibility requirements, ramping capability, not baseload dominance. Plants are designed to cycle up and down to balance renewables, not to define the system. This is where the phrase "solar surpassed coal" becomes technically misleading if read casually, but structurally accurate if read correctly. It is not about immediate energy output replacement. It is about the hierarchy of expansion capital. What gets built first, fastest, and most repeatedly defines the direction of the system more than what currently produces the most stable kilowatt hours. There is also an industrial feedback loop here that is easy to miss. Overcapacity in solar manufacturing pushed module prices down to levels where marginal deployment became almost reflexive. Developers don't wait for perfect grid conditions. They build because the economics assume future grid integration will eventually catch up. That assumption is doing a lot of hidden work. Because if grid upgrades lag too far behind, you don't get a smooth transition. You get accumulation stress, where installed capacity grows faster than usable throughput. And that creates a quieter uncertainty inside the system, not whether solar grows, but how much of it actually behaves like reliable capacity versus constrained potential. I'm not fully convinced the system has resolved that tension yet. The build-out is coherent, but the integration layer is still uneven across provinces. The underlying pattern, though, is consistent. Solar wins at the point of expansion decision-making because it aligns with speed, manufacturing strength, and administrative simplicity. Coal survives where stability and inertia still matter. Those are not competing systems in a clean sense. They are overlapping layers, each optimized for different constraints. And that overlap is where the real story sits. At this stage, the clean narrative people like to use, renewables replacing coal, starts to blur. Not because it's wrong in direction, but because it assumes a level of system coherence that doesn't exist in real time. China's grid is not a single machine optimizing toward one outcome. It's a stack of regional systems, pricing rules, political incentives, and infrastructure bottlenecks that don't always move together. And when you look at solar versus coal inside that stack, the tension isn't ideological, it's operational. Take utilization rates. This is where the numbers start to complicate the picture. In several northern and northwestern provinces, solar utilization can drop meaningfully during peak build-out phases. Not because panels stop working, but because transmission capacity and local demand cannot absorb instantaneous output. That creates curtailment, energy that exists on paper but doesn't enter the usable system. At the same time, coal plants in the same regions often maintain relatively high dispatch reliability. Not because they are preferred long-term, but because they can be scheduled. They fill gaps that are predictable in a way solar still isn't at scale without storage. So you get this paradox. Solar dominates new capacity additions, yet coal still dominates controllable energy availability in real operational planning. Both statements are true. That's the discomfort. Now add storage into the equation because it's often treated as the missing link that resolves everything. China is deploying battery storage aggressively. Utility-scale lithium-ion projects in provinces like Shandong and Jiangsu, alongside pumped hydro expansion in mountainous regions. But storage is still structurally smaller than generation growth. It improves flexibility at the margins, not full system equilibration. One report from the China Energy Storage Alliance in 2025 pointed to rapid growth in installed storage capacity, but even that expansion lags solar by a wide ratio. So while storage reduces curtailment pressure, it doesn't erase the imbalance between generation growth and grid absorption. And this is where coal's role becomes more technically specific than most commentary admits. Coal in China is increasingly acting as a balancing asset inside a renewable heavy system. That means ramping capability, frequency regulation, and backup generation during low sun or high demand periods. In older systems, coal was the foundation. Now it behaves more like structural insurance. But insurance doesn't disappear just because you buy more of something else. It just changes its function. There's a historical parallel worth mentioning, though it's imperfect. In the early stages of China's highway expansion in the 2000s, provincial governments often built infrastructure faster than traffic demand justified. Utilization lagged behind construction, but over time, economic activity caught up, and the excess capacity became the backbone of future growth. Energy systems are not identical to transport systems, but the sequencing logic is similar. Build first, optimize later, adjust behavior through usage patterns rather than upfront precision. The uncertainty here is timing, because solar expansion is now extremely fast. Coal adjustment is slow. Grid infrastructure sits in between, constrained by engineering cycles that cannot compress infinitely. So the question is not whether solar continues to grow. It will. The question is whether the system can integrate it without locking in chronic inefficiencies that persist for decades. There is also an external perception gap worth noting. Outside observers often interpret coal plant construction as contradiction, evidence that China is, quote, not really transitioning. But inside the system, coal approvals increasingly reflect risk management rather than growth strategy. That distinction matters. One is narrative inconsistency. The other is system redundancy. I'm not fully convinced either interpretation is sufficient on its own. The reality looks more like a dual-track system. One track aggressively scaling solar because it is industrially efficient, another maintaining coal because system stability still depends on it. And those tracks don't converge quickly. What makes this harder to read is that the imbalance is not immediately visible in total energy share charts. It shows up in marginal decisions. What gets built, what gets prioritized, what gets fast-tracked. And those marginal decisions are where long-term direction is actually encoded. Which brings us to a quieter tension. If solar continues to dominate expansion, but cannot yet dominate reliability, then the system is effectively building ahead of its own integration capacity. That doesn't automatically create failure, but it does create friction that accumulates over time. And whether that friction resolves cleanly or compounds into structural inefficiency is still an open question. If you strip away the commentary layer and just look at the sequence of decisions, China's energy system starts to resemble something less ideological and more industrially inevitable. Not in the sense of destiny, in the sense of constraints stacking faster than coordination can perfectly align them. Solar is winning expansion because it fits a very specific set of system needs right now: speed, manufacturability, and controllable capital deployment. Coal persists because the grid still depends on dispatchable backup in a system that hasn't finished building its flexibility layer. Both can be true without contradiction. And that's usually where the misunderstanding begins. What stands out most, if you follow the data year by year, is not that coal is disappearing or that solar is taking over. It's that the decision-making center of gravity has shifted. Coal is no longer the default assumption for new capacity. It has to justify itself inside a narrower set of use cases. That sounds subtle. It isn't. In infrastructure systems, defaults matter more than debates. Once a technology stops being the default expansion unit, its long-term trajectory changes, even if its absolute volume stays large for years. China's coal fleet is still massive, no ambiguity there. But the expansion logic is no longer anchored to it. That role has moved. Now, the uncomfortable part is what this creates in the medium term. If solar continues to scale faster than transmission upgrades and storage deployment, you don't get a smooth substitution curve. You get layered inefficiencies, regions with excess generation and constrained delivery, alongside regions still dependent on thermal backup. The system doesn't break, it just becomes uneven. And uneven systems are harder to price, harder to forecast, and harder to stabilize without continuous policy adjustment. I'm not fully convinced that the current pace of grid integration is sufficient to absorb the trajectory of solar expansion without recurring bottlenecks. There are strong engineering efforts underway: ultra-high voltage lines, regional balancing pools, storage incentives. But they are responding to a moving target, and the target is accelerating. Here's the prediction, based strictly on observable direction rather than optimism or skepticism. Solar will continue to dominate marginal capacity additions in China for the rest of this decade, and coal will remain structurally present far longer than most external narratives assume, not because it is preferred, but because system reliability evolves slower than capacity substitution. The gap between installed capacity leadership and actual energy dominance will persist longer than expected. And a lot of analysis built on clean transition assumptions will keep misreading that gap as contradiction rather than transition lag. My final view is simple. This isn't a story about solar defeating coal. It's a story about coal losing its monopoly on expansion logic while still holding on to its role in stability logic. Those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is where the next decade of global energy misinterpretations will come from. If there's one question I'd leave hanging, it's this: at what point does a system that builds faster than it integrates start redefining what capacity even means in practice? Because that answer will decide whether this is a controlled transition or an accumulation phase that forces its own correction later.